džiaugiamės, kad tiek daug žmonių susidomėjo ir prisijungė ir dar prisijungs prie šio webinaro Įtraukus švietimas tikrai veikia, kur girdėsime patirtį, kaip iš tiesų yra įgyvendinamas įtraukus švietimas Kanados Naujojo Bransviko provincijoje. Ir šiandien tikriausiai daugelis mūsų, kurie vienaip ar kitaip, viename ar kitame lygmenyje esame susiję su švietimo sistema. Ar būtume švietimo sistemos darbuotojai, kuriame nors lygmenyje nuo pradinių, tiksliau, nuo ankstyvojo ugdymo iki aukštojo mokslo. Ar mes būtumėm tėvai, kurie turi vaikus su negalia, iš tiesų šis klausimas ir artėjantis 2024 metai mums kelia nerimą, nes žinome, jog 2024 metai yra tie, kuomet visi vaikai su negalia jau galės dalyvauti įtraukiajame švietime. Ir mums tuomet kyla daug nerimo ir klausimų. Ar užteks mums žinių, ar užteks kompetencijų, kokiu keliu mums eiti, o ką daryti, jeigu nepavyks. Taigi iš tiesų šis seminaras, kurį organizuoja Lietuvos negalios forumos, vyksta labai savu laiku, labai geru, kad mes dar turime 2 metus į priekį apgalvoti šias patirtis, pagalvoti ir išbandyti, kas bus tinkama Lietuvos kontekste. Taigi dabar norėčiau su jumis plačiau pasidalinti taisyklėmis, kaip mes dirbsime ir būsime kartu visą šią popietę. Tai šiandieną mes girdėsime 2 pranešimus, kuriuos skaitys mūsų kolegos švietimo sistemos iš Kanados, Jody R, kuris buvo švietimo ministras Naujajame Brunswicke, ir Carr. Šiandieną dirbsime nuo 1 valandos iki 5.
Nesuprantu, kur čia garsas yra.
Taip, atleiskite už tai, kad skaidrės taip greitai praėjo. Aš sugrįšiu prie buvusių skaidrių ir jos kartojasi. Ir atsiprašau už techninius, štai galiu sustabdyti ir mano ir pelė neveikia labai gerai. Turiu atsiprašyti už techninius nesklandumus. Dabar atleiskite minutę.
Aš galiu.
Būkite empatiški, mano kompiuterio pelė nustojo veikti.
Kad gerai, nesklandumai.
Taip, techniniai nesklandumai, bet nuoširdžiai nelabai žinau, Lina, kaip aš galėčiau juos išspręsti.
Pasakyk man, ką aš galiu padaryti, ir tada viskas bus. Tu gali su klaviatūra tiesiog paspausti escape ir tada tiesiog tau tinka.
Taip. Žinot, turiu dabar labai atsiprašyti ir galbūt tiesiog žodžiu perduosiu kai kurias informaciją, kuri buvo minima skaidrėse. Tikrai atsiprašau už techninius nesklandumus, bet, kaip sakoma, atsitinka, pasitaiko visiems. Taigi šiandieną kokios bus taisyklės? Mes dirbsime nuo 1 valandos, tikriausiai iki 5, priklauso to, kiek ilgai mes diskutuosime kartu su šios dienos pranešėjais. Ir iš tiesų, pirmiausia, mes išgirsime kiekvieną pranešėją ir galėsime vėliau užduoti jam ar jai klausimus, o vėliau diskusija galės vykti jau po abiejų pranešėjų ir galėsime užduoti klausimus ir diskutuoti kartu su abiejų pranešėjais. Taip pat viduryje seminaro mes ketiname padaryti 15 minučių pertrauką. Tuomet norėčiau susitarti dėl tokių darbo taisyklių, kad mes tiesiog šio webinaro metu laikysime išjungtą mikrofoną, kai nekalbėsime. Renginys bus verčiamas į gestų kalbą ir tie žmonės, kurie kalba gestų kalba, kviečiami patys išsikelti vertėjo langelį savo patogiu būdu. Taip pat, jeigu pasižiūrėsite į savo kompiuterio ekrano, dešinės pusės apačioje yra toks pasirinkimas interpretation. Jūs galite paspaudę ant šios parinkties pasirinkti, kokia kalba norėtumėt klausyti šį webinarą, ar anglų, ar lietuvių kalba. Ir galiausiai, jeigu jūs norėsite užduoti kokį nors klausimą, jūs galite arba kelti ranką, arba rašyti pokalbių skiltyje. Tiek aš, tiek Lina Garbenčiūtė galėsime sužiūrėti šiuos klausimus. Ir jeigu bus techninių klausimų, prašom rašyti žinutę ir seminaras bus įrašomas. Tai tiek iš mano pusės būtų su techninių detalių, su techniniais nesklandumais, bet tikiuosi, kad toliau viskas eisis daug sklandžiau. Ir dabar pirmiausiai įžanginį žodį norėčiau tarti švietimo ministerijos atstovę, ilgametę specialistę įtraukaus ugdymo srityje, Gražiną Šeibokienę.
Tai laba diena visiems. Man tikrai labai didžiulė garbė yra kalbėti tokiai garbiai auditorijai. Ir pirmiausia, tai noriu atsiprašyti ir tarti tą atsiprašymo žodį nuo mūsų viceministro Ramūno Skaudžiaus, kuris tikrai dėjo dideles pastangas, kad galėtų dalyvauti šitam renginy ir galėtų išgirsti iš pirmų lūpų, kaipgi Kanadai pavyko padaryti tokį didelį šuolį įtraukiajame švietime. Bet jis tikrai siunčia kuo geriausius linkėjimus ir yra mintimis su mumis čia. Mes esame pakankamai nemaža ministerijos komanda prisijungusi ir tikrai su dideliu entuziazmu girdėsime turbūt kiekvieną svečių žodį ir perduosime ministerijos vadovybei tai, ką būsime čia išgirdę. Ir tuo pačiu noriu labai padėkoti Lietuvos negalios organizacijų forumui už tokį renginį ir iš vis už tą 20 metų darbą, kurį atlieka šita organizacija, būdama tiek negalios organizacijas vienijančius atstovus, tiek visą Lietuvos bendruomenę, nes kartu su jais mes iš ties galėjome priimti politinius sprendimus, tokius kaip švietimo įstatymo pakeitimo įstatymas priimtas prieš metus laiko. Ir kartu su būtent jų dėka mes galėjome sudėlioti žingsnius, tam tikras kryptis, ką mes turėtume kartu visi padaryti, kad 24 metai, kurie greitai ateis į mūsų šalį, jie nekeltų tiek daug įtampų ir nerimo, apie kurias kartais mes girdime iš įvairių visuomenės grupių, nes įtraukties procesai mums dar nėra savastis. Ir mums dar reikia visiems kartu tikrai ieškoti ir gerosios praktikos ir tartis kartu, kokį kelią mes kartu turime nueiti, kaip išvengti galbūt smegduobių, kurios turbūt visada atsiranda einant nežinomų kelių. Todėl mums tikrai šiandien ypatingai svarbu yra šitas seminaras ir mes tikrai su dideliu susidomėjimu klausysime, kaip pavyko Kanados Bransviko provincijai pasiekti tokių gerų rezultatų. Tai mes iš ties čia dalyvaujame pakankamai skirtingas dalyvių skaičius. Ir tikimės, kad būtent šitie dalyviai, kuriems esu be galo dėkinga už įvairiapusį palaikymą, nes tikrai įtraukti švietime neįmanoma be praktikų, be nevyriausybinių organizacijų, be įvairių interesų grupių, kurioms rūpi šitie klausimai, palaikymo ir paskatinimo, padrąsinimo ir patarimų, kaip būtų galima Tai tikrai noriu šiandien jūs visiems jums padėkoti už tai, kad jūs esate, kad jūs domitės, kad tikrai norite, kad tie procesai vyktų sklandžiai. Ir tikrai linkiu visiems gero, konstruktyvaus klausymosi ir darbo, kelti atvirus klausimus, ieškoti atsakymų ir išgirsti juos iš žmonių, kuriems tai pavyko. Taip pat labai noriu padėkoti ir visiems, kurie iki šiol galbūt dar nėra tikintys tą idėją, kad įtraukti švietime yra gėris ir kad mes tikrai turėtume dėl jos visi, turbūt pereiti į šitą tikėjimą. Tai iš tikrųjų, norėčiau pakviesti tikrai tuos abejojančius galbūt. Irgi gerai sėkmingos patirtys, jos labiausiai įkvepia, labiausiai padrąsina ir suteikia vilties. Aš tikrai žinau, kad mums yra daug iššūkių ir mes tikrai tuos iššūkius ir tas siekius susidėliojom į veiksmų programą, kurią patvirtino švietimo, mokslo ir sporto ministrė spalio 14 dieną. Mes turime nusimatę veiksmus ir rezultatus, nusimatę lėšas, ką mes turime padaryti per tuos likusius metus iki 24 metų. Bet tie rezultatai ir tie siekiai bus pasiekti tik tuo atveju, jeigu tikinčiųjų armija didės ir jeigu mes tikrai pakeisime požiūrį į įtraukti švietime, į tai, kokią pridėtinę vertę jinai kuria tinkamas ugdymo ar gyvenimo sąlygas, bet visai visuomeniai. Ir todėl aš tikrai labai džiaugiuosi ir noriu padėkoti ir kolegoms svečiams iš Kanados, kurie sutiko šiandien dalinti savo praktiką, kurie tikrai pastiprins ir įkvėps mus. Ir mes tikiuosi po šito seminaro išeisime kur kas labiau tikintys idėją, kad įtraukti švietime ir Lietuvoje yra įmanoma. Tai sėkmės visiems ir gražaus seminaro, gero darbo.
Ačiū, gerbiama Gražina, jums už tokį įkvepiantį pasidalinimą ir išties norėdami pasiekti to, kad Lietuvoje įsigyvendintų įtraukaus švietimo idėją, mes tikrai, kaip jūs ir sakėt, mes turim visi bendradarbiauti ir mūsų visų pastangos yra labai svarbios. Tai dabar norėčiau perduoti žodį Lietuvos neįgaliųjų forumo atstoviai, ekspertai Linai Garbenčiūtei, supažindinti mus, kaip kilo idėja suorganizuoti būtent šį webinarą.
Tai sveiki visi, laba diena visiems, labai dėkoju, kad prisijungėt ir parodėte tokį didelį susidomėjimą, tai tikrai nesitikėjome, kad tiek daug dalyvių sulauksime ir matau tikrai atstovus iš viso švietimo sektoriaus, nuo Seimo narių, ministerijų atstovų, skirtingų švietimo bendruomenės, mokytojų ir negalios organizacijų atstovų. Tai tikrai ačiū jums visiems ir tai tik parodo, kad iššūkiai ir tikslai yra visi mūsų bendri, yra laikas kritikai ir yra laikas bendram darbui ir susitelkimui. Tai aš tikiu, kad gerieji pavyzdžiai yra būtent ta dalis, kurios mums visiems labai norisi, kad tikrai, kaip gerbiama Gražina sakė, kad mes tikrai patikėtume, kad tas įtraukus švietimas gali būti ir yra ta kryptis, kurią mes visi turime eiti. Ir tikrai noriu dar sykį ir padėkoti ir palinkėti visiems gero seminaro, o pati turėjau galimybę Kendrą ir Jody išgirsti prieš 2 metus Dubline, Trinity College ir mane ir tai tikrai labai įkvėpė ir tada supratau, kad labai norėčiau juos pakviesti atvykti į Lietuvą, bet dėl visų žinomų aplinkybių, pandemijų ir iššūkių tai darosi, taip labai sunku, bet yra šiais laikais yra visas įmanomas galimybės ir visi įmanomas priemonės susijungti su Kanada, kad ir tokiais būdais tiesiogiai internetu, tai dėl to tikrai džiaugiamės ir tikiuosi, kad būsite aktyvus, užduokite klausimus ir perduodu žodį Jody. Tai ačiū labai jums visiems.
Taip, dabar iš tiesų aš pradėsiu kalbėti anglų kalbą, truputėlį norėdama pasikalbėti su pačiu Jody. So, dear Jody, it's so fantastic that you are here now together with Kendra. And I also have heard your presentation in Trinity College together with Lena, which was charming, impressive, unbelievable, and that it really can work, you know, and right now and here. And I would like to invite now everybody to, you know, have their cups of coffee or tea or water, and just take your notebooks, take your pencils, because definitely you will need, you know, to write up good ideas, because Jody, who was at the time Minister of Education and secondary education, he not only in theoretical level was talking about inclusive education, he actually made it real, made it implementable, and he can share the know-how from practical experience. So I welcome you, give you the floor, and I myself already also prepare a notebook and a pen to write good ideas. So,
good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so very much to Lina and Ruta. Thank you for all of you for joining us. And it's quite exciting. I'm very pleased to have to be here with Kendra as well from New Brunswick, Canada. I'm just going to set up my screen in a second here. Okay, how is that? Is that good, Ruta?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so first off, I want to mention that by no means are we experts in terms of perfection. It is a journey and we're working towards that. You can right now Google New Brunswick, Canada, and you will find stories of people not happy with inclusive education. I think we share that, of course, around the world in terms of the challenge that it takes to move forward with inclusive education. So we have done what we've been able to do in our circumstances in New Brunswick, and it gives you a glimpse of our example. Of course, your example and your progress and your situation in Lithuania is unique to you, and you can hopefully take from some of what we have said and done and adapt it to potentially a perspective of your process and your implementation. And we can talk more about that. And really, we could talk for days. So we will try to limit, obviously, to what we can share in the most essential that we can think of. But this, as you know, is an ongoing dialogue. I'm so pleased that Lithuania has an action plan. And it's very exciting to see that you're committed and moving forward. Today's part of our presentation will be a transition to inclusive education. My part of the presentation will be policy and legislation, the overall framework of that perspective moving forward from a statewide or provincial perspective. Kendra Frizzell, she will, as a director and principal of a school in just near our capital or within our capital of Fredericton, New Brunswick, our capital city, she will share from the school level the real practical, visual and journey at a school level that a leader and the teachers and educators and parents transition through for successful inclusive education. I think I'm doing what, there we go. Ruta was doing. Just a small bit about me is that I was elected to our provincial legislature. I want to mention that I was elected at age 23 to 2018. Within that time, as Ruta had mentioned, I was Minister of Education from 2010 into 2013. And then Minister of Post-Secondary Education.
Nu kas yra to, nu ko tu kali, nu tai nevažiuoja. Nevažiuoja.
I'm sorry, bet norėčiau paprašyti išsijungti mikrofonus visų dalyvaujančiųjų.
Kas? Viskas?
I am sorry.
That's okay.
Reality.
That's all right. It reminds me of the legislature when they interrupt me when I'm speaking, because the politicians, I still can't shake that talking all the time. I'm just joking, but just one sec. There we go. Okay. Oh. Okay. So, of course, as was mentioned, during that time, I did have a focus on inclusive education and integrated services. And now I had since finishing as a member of the legislature, I've become a lawyer, and I research and study in the legislative requirements for inclusive education from a human rights perspective. And I practice law in New Brunswick. I'm also a member or an expert advisor with Inclusion International, and also Inclusive Education Canada, providing advice and support in many places around implementing inclusive education. Where is New Brunswick, Canada? Just briefly, New Brunswick is on the east coast of Canada. We're one of the 13 Canadian provinces. We're just above Boston, New York. We have a landmass area that's just a bit bigger than Lithuania, but our population is quite tiny. We have a population of only 750,000 people. In our school system, the number of students that we have is just around 100,000 students. So in perspective, this is telling you as well a perspective about how and why we've been able to do certain things. But also, I always say, what you're going to hear, if the naysayers, they'll say, yeah, but, yes, but, yes, but, New Brunswick this, yes, but that. Foundationally and fundamentally, you have to believe that inclusive education is the right way to go. And regarding your situations and your dynamics within your jurisdiction, then you adapt and make plans accordingly. Other thing I want to mention is that Canada does not have a national minister of education. Our system is devolved where every province has their own minister of education, and our constitution is such that each province is responsible solely for our own education system. So education ministers across Canada work together, but we're not bound by one national piece of legislation. So you're going to see in Canada a variety of practice, like you would see in almost anywheres, great examples of inclusive education, and you're going to see other examples within Canada of special education or segregated education still. And so just keep that in mind. And likewise, in New Brunswick, you will see excellent versions of inclusive education. And while we do not have any special schools, we no longer have special schools, you may from time to time Google New Brunswick and see that there's a student that's struggling, or a parent that's struggling, or someone that questions the value of inclusive education. And that, and so then you will continue to see that we also still have challenges. We have struggled or have challenges over 30, 40, 50 years of implementing inclusive education. The most important point is that we continue on a step forward and moving forward and working together. What I've always said is when you see excellent examples of inclusive education in one school or one classroom, let's say one school, then you know it can happen in other schools. And I've said, even in New Brunswick, if inclusive education is happening in one school, why then across the street or down the road, inclusive education can't happen? It just can't work here, people will say, or it's just not the same, or we just can't. The thing is, it's not the water. What is it that makes one school be able to implement inclusive education? There are a number of factors, of course, but if it's possible in one school, it's possible in every school. And hopefully New Brunswick can shine light, as well as your own positive examples in Lithuania, that where it happens in one, it can happen in all with the right ingredients. Why inclusive education? Inclusive education, we don't have to spend a whole lot of time, but we do need to talk as well about why. In New Brunswick, we have seen the value of inclusive education. We have seen that inclusive education, it's values driven in New Brunswick. When children learn together in schools, they learn to live together in society. And our public schools and classrooms must reflect what we want as a society. So we have a value that all children are included and all children get the very best of our system and our most trained educators within the same opportunities, whether it's the classroom or field trips or extracurricular activities. We base it on moving forward with inclusive education because of research. The research is clear. Internationally, the research has said that there are many benefits of mixed ability learning environments, socially, educationally, and financially. So the research is clear. I haven't seen any research really, or much research around the segregated model of outcomes and results. If we want a society that's inclusive and welcoming, it starts with our schools, whether it's early childhood learning or public education. That represents what we want as a society going forward. We have better outcomes for struggling learners. And there are also research right here in Canada, in Toronto School District, that students that are streamed or segregated streams to lower academic levels or programming, their outcomes after school for employment is less than other students that have been given the opportunity in inclusive programming. And we can also share more information about that if you would like. And not only as well for employment opportunities, but post-secondary education. For students that are streamed in the inclusive system, students with struggles, learning disabilities, they will more likely go to post-secondary education and have higher employment, as opposed to the same students that are struggling in a segregated system. And also human rights-based. We also have signed the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Canada in 2010. And that was a huge impetus for New Brunswick to move forward with initiating a big step in inclusive education in 2010 to 2013. The human rights-based, it says internationally, as well as our local human rights body has said that inclusive education, where all children have the same opportunities learning together in the same school and in the same classrooms, is their fundamental human right. And decisions have been taken to the Supreme Court of Canada that says inclusive education is the preferred model, and access to support and access to intervention has to be timely. But general comment number 4 under the CRPD committee explains very well that inclusive education is about including and giving intervention inclusively. As I mentioned, children that learn together in school learn to live together in society. That's the foundation of what we believe in. When we have students that are entering our school, our public school, we don't at the door say, no, you don't belong here, you go down the street, you go somewhere else. So our students and our schools are designed by catchment geographic area. There generally is no choice for which school parents send their children. Our enrollment is based on geographic area. So if you live in a geographic area where the elementary school is, the middle, a middle school or a high school, then that is the school you're designated to go to. There are exceptions that can be given based on employment or transportation, but transportation is provided by the public school system. But again, if you live in a neighborhood, you're going to the same school where the neighborhood children normally would go. If your brothers and sisters are going to a certain school, that is the school you will go to, no matter your disability or your difference, your ethnicity, your language ability, that is the school you're designated to. We no longer have special schools. Those were closed in the 1980s. We had private schools. The parents had come forward and said, we want to be part of the public school system. And at that crossroads, the government of New Brunswick, under a charter or the Constitution, said, we will support going to public schools and we'll make it happen. Of course, there's been a journey since then, and I can talk more about that. And as I mentioned just now, dynamic inclusive education is a journey, not a destination. It is not you wake up one morning and it happens miraculously, or that it happens after 3 years. It is a journey. Unfortunately, people don't like to hear that it's been, it's a 30-year or 40-year. It's a progress. You make steps forward, and you do it together in partnerships. And that's what we've done here in New Brunswick, working together with teachers and educators. The nonprofit sector, NGOs, has been critical, and working with parents and to move forward together in the steps forward. Does everyone agree? No. I can tell you there are often disagreements. But by and large now in New Brunswick, we agree with inclusive education. It's often the questions we get is, we need more support. We need more resources. We need more educators. We need more intervention. We need more differentiation. We need more specialist support. But what I've said is that we also hear that in segregated systems around the world, or specialized systems. Special schools are underfunded. Mainstream schools are underfunded. So I say, you know what? People will say inclusive education's too expensive. Inclusive education just can't happen because there's not enough resources. Well, you know what? I haven't found one system in the world where they will tell you that there's enough resources, thank you, put the money somewhere else. So that being said, if both systems are underfunded, then I always choose inclusive education, and we make it work with the funds we have. And of course, we always push to have more funding and more support. So a little bit about what is inclusive education. And of course, everyone has are at a different level of their understanding, and we continue to learn. We continue to research. We continue to look at better practices and share amongst each other. But what I wanted to mention is that inclusive education is not just putting kids with disabilities in the mainstream school. It's a mindset, and as much as we read it, it's hard to understand. probably over 20 years ago, was my first conference, my first seminar I went to with Dr. Gordon Porter from Canada, from New Brunswick, actually. And I believed in principle of inclusive education. I still couldn't understand it. What do you mean going to the same classroom? We're not, how do you learn, how do you do math if you're not at the same level? Like, I agree we all should be together, but practically, I just don't know. Well, I was able to, in that week-long seminar, actually learn and feel and see what we meant by being together and how the teacher is supported to differentiate and to include, because there is a value and we never really know necessarily what every student is learning. And as much as we can benefit students with disabilities, we're benefiting all students to experience the joys, the pleasures, the disappointments, the understanding of the differences that every child makes and provides. And so there's so much value that we can't always see in numbers and on paper. But we do know there's value there in the research. We know there's value in friendships. We know there's value after high school, after school, about our friends and our neighbors and who our community members are and who we were going to hire at places of work. So there's lots there. But what it isn't, it's not just, oh, you're going to go into the mainstream school. Again, we have two kind of parallel systems. We have the mainstream system, and then we have the kind of specialized other system, or the special education system. And that can occur in separate schools. It can occur in the same school with separate streams. And what we're talking about is we're merging and changing a mainstream mindset and changing a segregated special school mindset and merging them into one holistic, inclusive education system. That is very, very difficult. And it takes a lot of sustained effort. And what happens is we're taking on quite a huge challenge. And everyone, no matter which system you're in, is a challenge. And you feel like you're losing something, and you're fearful, and people don't like to change, and it's hard. And so it's not just about making students go into the mainstream and everything stays the same in the mainstream. It's really dismantling both and then bringing them in together into a new way of doing. Now, will it be in a so-called mainstream school? Will it be in a special education school that changes? Yeah, the location may be different as well, or it might be the same for some students. So anyways, it's that understanding. But the beauty of inclusive education is when you get there and you get there closer to the magic that happens, then everyone gains. The state gains, the students with disabilities gain, students without disabilities gain, the community is better overall. For instance, we have apples and we have oranges. In Canada, we say it's not apples and oranges, or it's apples and oranges, two different things. And that, we have apples maybe would be mainstream, and oranges would be segregation or segregated specialized services. And what we're doing is merging them, and we're creating bananas. It's a nutty thought. That's when I hear bananas, I think, oh, we're way out there thinking of different things, doing different things. But that's exactly the type of challenge we're moving towards. I wanted to illustrate just a little bit, maybe another way to see inclusive education. We have a big ship, a big boat. We're going to pretend that that's kind of the mainstream school. And an old way of thinking about changing to inclusive education is that we have this larger, or this mainstream school with all the kids. They're up on deck, they're having a great time. But then we have the specialized and special schools. And we have often, I'm not certain about Lithuania and how your budgets work and how much money you spend where, but often in countries, the specialized services or the segregated special schools for disabilities are underfunded and are less than. And in some countries, they can be, in quite bad shape. And so we have children with disabilities and different and language issues and whatnot. And we're saying, okay, we're going to start merging, and I know quite a percentage are all together in regular schools in Lithuania, the same as they had been in New Brunswick, that they are all going together in the same school. But often what happens when we have children with disabilities in the same school, in the old mainstream model, is that they come to the school and they're placed in different places in the school. Maybe they never actually go in the front door. I've seen when I was involved with when I was elected in politics before I became minister, students were going into maybe the side door, maybe the maintenance door, the basement. All the other kids come in the front door. Students with disabilities were going in the side door, because often you would hear things like, it's safer for them there. But what type of visual does that send to everyone else? It says you're less than. When we have students that come into our schools, if they're new students, regular new students, we don't shun them into other classrooms. We make sure they're introduced to the entire school, to the entire classroom, and that they're welcomed, and everyone has benefit and beauty and gifts and skills, and we accommodate and we find a way to make it work. But often in the old systems, students with disabilities will be placed in, let's say on the boat, they're in a different room and less than, instead of all together working and sharing and understanding. In other systems, they will take the special schools, and where there's leaking holes, governments and people will think, oh, let's build those schools up bigger and better too. Let's have the same type of boat so that they have a big boat too. And then you're still running two parallel big boats down the stream. And those are hard to maintain, two big boats. And what we found in New Brunswick, a lot of times because of our size, is that we couldn't afford two big boats. We had to have one big boat and with one ship captain and everyone working together. But how do you make that transition? It's hugely challenging, but it is possible. So there's just a small visualization. Oh, we're taking another load over. But it's more than that, as you know. Catalyst for change. Some of my slides here. So some perspective of what it takes for change. Just a second, yes. Oh, there we go. Thought I had received a message from someone about how I was doing, but I think it's okay. Certainly send me a message if there's some complications or you can't understand something I'm trying to say.
Yes, Jody, you are doing just fine. It's just some technicalities with translation, that's all. So,
okay.
Yeah, just go further on.
Okay, if I need to go slower or anything like that for translation, let me know. Okay,
it's
good.
Just all fine.
Good, great. And what I do find as well is that once we open up for questions or comments or whatnot, then we can delve into more of what you're interested in hearing about. But now the catalyst for change, some perspective required is political will. It takes political will and leadership. I was fortunate. I had, well, not fortunate, but I heard from a lot of parents in my district at my office, people that were voters. They would come to me and say, you know, I want better services. I want my children to be included. There were many examples of if they were in a mainstream school, students were in a mainstream school, but the student was left out of the field trip, the special field trip, because there wasn't enough support. Or here's another example, a student named Neil in a wheelchair, had no visual, no verbal language, and some learning disability as well, was going on the field trip. That was great, but he was provided a special needs bus that had room for 30, 40 kids. And as they were getting on the bus in the morning, all the other kids were on another bus together. And when they were going on the field trip, they all loaded on the other bus, and Neil loaded on the special needs bus. And it was so obvious that there were so many differences, but the bus where all the kids were together, the regular kids, it was overcrowded. And the other thing is that they were all on there quickly. It took Neil a little longer to get on his bus. So the kids on the regular bus left before Neil did. And they went on their way, and Neil was still getting loaded onto his special needs bus. And his parents were profoundly upset, because how did that make it feel to Neil in terms of leaving? And they also said, why would you send an overcrowded bus and only another bus with only one student? Why wouldn't you mix and use the space, and everyone's together and we all leave together? And I said, when I became minister, either all, that all children, it's one, it's one for all and all for one. That's what we do in our school systems, in our community. And we're teaching the way we are acting and make decisions. So that was one example. Another example, on a Sunday night before school started, the next morning, a child with autism is in the mainstream school, was going to school the next day, expecting to go on a field trip. And because the school didn't have support in place the night before, they called and said, he can't go on the field trip the next morning. The student was disappointed profoundly. He was excited, looking forward to it, and then was left out. And the night before, what a disappointing conversation that all the other kids got to go, but because we couldn't get the additional support person to stay after 3 o'clock for when they were returning, then he didn't get to go. He was allowed to go if his parent was willing to volunteer and go on the bus as well. And I said then, that was before I became minister. And when I became minister, I said, on field trips, either all kids go or no kids go. That's political leadership and political will. Is everyone happy about that? No. Is it the right thing to do? Yes. And we make it work. We don't leave kids behind. We wouldn't. If a child couldn't afford, because of low income, to go on a field trip, we make sure that we put resources together and make sure funds are covered so that all kids get to go. And parents have stepped up in New Brunswick. Parents have helped other parents. And there's been so many examples of where regular parents have stepped in and made choices and helped support parents of students with disabilities to make sure they're included. Teachers need help. That is very fundamental. The Department of and Ministry must work with Teachers Union and must work with teachers to provide support. And that's support for all teachers. If we're transitioning from special schools to regular schools to make more inclusive schools, then they need support as well. There's a role for every teacher. That role might be different. And we have to work with teachers to provide the support in a classroom that's inclusive. And Kendra will talk about the leadership that's required at the principal level, but also the support that's required from the departmental level, the ministry, to provide that support. Will there ever be enough support? No, but we can keep working. People will say, oh, inclusion doesn't work. And I often say it's because we're not working inclusion properly. It's not inclusion, it's the elements we need to put in place to make inclusion work. But by and large, it's so important that we keep supporting teachers in the transitioning. Families demand better, and that has certainly helped initiate and make change happen, working with our NGOs and the Lithuania Disability Forum, as an example. You know, they represent families, we understand families, but also families that have fears. Often families in theory support inclusive education, but they're scared to have their children go to a mainstream school that's transitioning to inclusive school, because sometimes the transition occurs by placing students, but not doing the full dynamic change of providing the support necessary. And students will go to the basement, as we saw in the big boat image. They'll go somewhere else, they'll be bullied, or they won't get the support and they will regress. And so that gives a bad name to inclusive education. And so we have to make sure we dialogue and keep working with parents so that we can get the proper support in place and support the teachers and communicate. But that's all big challenges. But families have driven these changes. And your ministry representative had mentioned we all have to work together. Often I heard, well, teachers need more support, but they would refuse to have volunteers or refuse to bring families in to have a discussion. Families are the experts, teachers are the experts, so are the support service providers, have something to contribute. And we can talk about that, of how we changed, or we made sure through our transition to have education support teams in place, where there's a dialogue every week amongst teachers, administrators, family members at times if they're needed, and the intervention support services to dialogue about where the educational plans are for students with disabilities and providing the proper support. Money, I talked about that in terms of there being never enough funds. No matter what, people will say we need more funding. And as I said, with segregated or inclusive education, there's never enough. Our focus in our education system in New Brunswick is a coordinated and integrated support for all students, and it's less costly by being more efficient and effective. Now, can you say that we need more money? Yes, of course. But again, the financial benefit as well from moving to more inclusive societies. When we're looking at our labor force, we're looking at needing to hire people. We have a shortage. We need more people working into jobs. There's a great capacity. We see lots of international companies talk about inclusion and diversity, and in the workplace being a beneficial attribute to businesses. So again, I already touched on that in terms of the financial and the cost, and having an inclusive system is actually about building the capacity of the system to work for all students more effectively. And is it hard? Yeah, as I mentioned. A bit of New Brunswick's timeline. I won't go into all of the details, but just to mention that we do have a timeline as well. We went from private residential schools. We had auxiliary classes, which were special classes. We had lots of studies and lots of reviews and lots of struggles. We had also lots of political leadership that said we need to make change. And we had lots of leadership with families that said we need to make change. We had challenges of transitioning teachers' unions from the segregated auxiliary model. Transitioning into one teachers' union was a challenge. Training and recognition and credentials, those were all challenges over the years. We moved with Canada, had a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. That made a big difference for us in New Brunswick. In 1986, we mandated that schools would be fully responsible, public schools would be fully responsible for all children. As I mentioned, we started closing then the private schools. At that point, those private schools weren't institutionalized as much. We had one large private school, and that was certainly a challenge politically, to close that large education children's institution. Students from all over the province went to that school. When we were closing it, some family members some parents didn't even tell their other siblings that they had siblings in that school. Those were some of the real challenges of the reality of human life. So we had a lot of learning and a lot of change. We also did have a regional school for the Maritimes for the deaf and hard of hearing. And what we did around transitioning that school It was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We maintained the service from the school as a specialized service. Instead of sending students there to go to school and live, we send teachers from that shared service out to the schools, and they go to the public school where the student resides, and they provide support to the teacher, support to the student. Sometimes a student will travel to that specialized school to get an assessment or some training to understand, to fit equipment, certain things like that. But by and large, that agency, that support that's shared by our maritime provinces hires teachers to go out to the schools where the students are, instead of the other way around. Another larger jurisdiction, that might be more difficult, but still the concept is children need to live at home with their parents, with their families, next to their neighbors and their siblings. In the long run, you're going to get more support than sending away. Anyways, as I mentioned, 2010, we ratified the CRPD. In 2010 to 2017, I became minister in 2010, strong political leadership from my party and my premier. And we started piloting and implementing integrated service. And that's taking all of the services from health, education, public safety, social services. And instead of making parents and families go to 8 different doors to find service, we turned it upside down and said, let those services all come to the family at the school level. In theory, that's what we did, and have one file for the family, and the civil servants and the professionals feed into that file and share the file. Now again, implementation, it's been up and down in terms of how well it's been implemented. But in theory, we provide the support at the school in the community level where the student is, and we share services and communication amongst the departments. In 2013 is when I signed the new policy 322. We had not had policy in place. We had legislation, but no policy. We also found that there was a wide variance of practice. And as I said, there were great places that were great work was happening. And then there was places that needed improvement. And so we try to bring everyone forward on a initiative of improvement, like we would a student in a classroom. No student is bad or good. The students are where they're at, and we try to bring them along. Same with our schools and our school system in terms of inclusive education. They're where they're at. They bring great value. They're doing great things in some ways. We want them to be better. And how do we work together to make those schools better for everyone and progress forward? Of course, in this time period, we really focused on universal design for learning. You've heard that. This is a way to support our classroom teachers in particular, to provide a structure and framework around the instructional design in the classroom. Kendra can talk much more about that. As an educator, she can do that. And we really focused on every child learning differently and the value that that child brings to the classroom. Some children, if they're, let's say they're in a wheelchair, they can't speak, maybe they don't really have a lot of intellectual ability like the other students. Maybe we don't really know what they're learning because they can't communicate and we can't quite tell. But they participate. For instance, they might be put in group work. Let's say there's a project on volcanoes and students are divided into groups. Well, that group of students, along with the student with the disability, will be working together. And maybe one student builds part of the volcano, one student writes the speech that's going along with describing the volcano. But then the student with the disability in his wheelchair has a tray, and maybe that student gets to hold the volcano as part of the presentation. And the volcano is placed on the student's tray, and they're participating that way. So there's mindset and change and what's the value, and moving away from everyone's getting 90s and 100s versus everyone's involved and everyone's learning at their level. Easier said than done, but there are tools in place that we provide to teachers, such as universal design for learning. Okay. Again, more about inclusive education in New Brunswick. Very enjoyable. And now the great thing about Zoom is we all get to kind of shut our camera off if we want. And of course, none of you are doing other work. And I appreciate that. But then we can stretch our arms and kind of keep getting a drink of coffee. And we will carry on for sure. Ruta, is there anything else you'd like to mention while I'm still going here?
Just that it's really interesting, and I'm already gathering, questions.
Okay.
Yeah, about your presentation. So thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. All is fine. Good. Good. We'll keep going. Where are we? 3 elements of inclusive education implementation: planning, implementing, sustaining. So with the 3 kind of key elements of the process of change, again, is planning and review, implementing, transitioning, and sustaining those efforts. As I mentioned, it's not just a one-time, one initiative, one webinar, one training, and that's it, you're experts, we're done. Sometimes what we've noticed in New Brunswick over time is priorities changed by the government or the minister. Sometimes it was innovation and computers in the classroom, so then they focus on that. Other times it's innovation or special projects, community school, entrepreneurial schools, and we focus on that. And then when I became minister, I really focused on inclusive education because I felt, and the research says that inclusive education is the fundamental to all else. You're going to work on computers in the classroom. You have to know how to work that for all students. An entrepreneurial school based on entrepreneurial projects, setting up a business in their classroom is beautiful for inclusion because every student has a role to play within the classroom. And we have in New Brunswick some schools that are entrepreneurial schools where it's really just project-based learning, but they do it by setting up kind of a business, an entrepreneurial aspect. They raise funds that usually get donated to a nonprofit organization, but every child has a role to play like you would in a business. Not everyone can be the president and the CEO, but some groups will put on a play as an example, and every child has a role to play, as I said. Someone will be the CEO, someone will be the marketing manager, one student will be the financial person, and a student might be a greeter at the door of the event. There's aspects there, but anyway, I digress. So I know what happens though is people change priorities. It has to be sustained. Anyways, planning and review. Again, political will. Politicians that are exposed to the problems need to step up and be a leader. Yes, we want to listen to people, we want to work with people, but you've made a commitment that we must do this. We are obligated to do it. We must do it, and we're going to work together on how to transition. That's why it's really exciting that you have an action plan in Lithuania, and how do we see ourselves in that, and how can we move forward so we all win? What I did was in 2010, I assigned, it was, as I said, a political priority. 2010, we just signed the CRPD. I had support from the Premier. It was in our election platform that we'd provide more support for students and our schools. I appointed 2 ministers' advisors, and we initiated a review, another review. But I wanted this not to be just another review. I wanted it to be a result of action, and I wanted to engage schools and the leaders in our schools. So the 2 ministers' advisors selected 35 school leaders, principals, and used that group for feedback and sounding board. They did school visits, and it was almost used as a professional development. Some of our principals were given time to go visit other schools. And when are we ever given time to do that? Very rarely. But you do learn from, like we are in this webinar, learn from each other. We can learn from other schools and get ideas and be there to support each other. So that group worked together. over about a year's period, and with partners as well. So we had working with parents and with organizations, getting their feedback. And we wanted to understand what, why, and how was working. We wanted to look at how we were supporting schools and what was needed to provide improvement, and how we could meet the diverse needs of regular classrooms in this change. We learned that there was a lack of clarity around what inclusion meant. There still is. You're going to find people in our school system that still think it's a student in the same classroom 100% of the time, and it isn't. It can be a diverse group of students, and the student, it's fluid. The student can come in and out of the classroom with intentional support on the issues that they need to have worked with. Usually their intervention is at the school, but they'll come back into the classroom. Sometimes it's not a full day in the classroom, sometimes it's, but what we don't do is isolate students based on their disability and diagnosis in a special classroom in the basement of the school or in another school. Anytime we do remove from the classroom, it's ideally for intervention support for that student based on an education plan. It's not just our assumption that they can't learn here, they have to go somewhere else. It's so easy to put students somewhere else and other them, other place, other student, someone else's problem. But instead we have to include. Anyway, there's lack of clarity, lack of training on best practices, and need to continue moving forward. So from that process, we had a report and recommendations, and then we had implementation. And with our implementation from 2012 or so to 2015, beyond after I was done being minister, but we had a 3-year plan. So smaller plans, 3 to 5 years. Dollars were redirected to support teachers. We were able to get new funding from the Premier, but we were able to find efficiencies and redirect them to support. So this wasn't about cuts, even though often there is a challenge with unions when they're vocal about this being about cuts and saving money, and we can't do this, and we're already under-resourced. Yes, we are already under-resourced, but it's not about cutting the budget. It's about spending those dollars more effectively and providing support to classroom teachers where the magic of learning happens. And how we did that was by hiring 25 or so inclusion experts. Again, they had to be trained, the bright lights of already implementing inclusive education at their schools. And they were hired to provide support to schools and teachers to implement and transition. Sometimes the plan might be to shut off the tap of new students entering these specialized programs. So we may have said there's a special classroom down a certain wing it would be called the inclusion wing, except it was segregated. So you got to watch for those terminologies that by changing the name doesn't change how people feel or how they're being treated. So we would say, okay, well, we're going to have a 2-year plan where we're going to not put new students into that system, into that setting. And we're going to start moving the existing kids into regular classrooms, or we'll work with families to transition once they finish school. But we shut the tap off of new students going into those and work with students. Sometimes we had to push it and said, no, next year we're all going into the regular classrooms. But in our budgeting process, we identified funds to be targeted to hotspots where we pushed a little harder and there was pushback or stress in the system. Then we had additional support where we could hire a person in, an expert, a retired teacher, maybe a consultant that could come in and provide support to the team at the school. We also had an implementation committee, an implementation team, the minister's implementation team on Inclusive Education Action Plan. So we had representatives from the Teachers Union, from the family NGOs, from nonprofit organizations, and the Department of Education, the ministry. And so we worked kind of updating as we kept going to hear the feedback, to change, to implement, to have those strong discussions if needed, and to stay firm though on our direction forward. We worked from this on defining roles of our school, of our Department of Education was one thing. So how we structured our department previous to this was the segregated model. We were modeling in the Department of Education, the segregated model. We had curriculum, we had innovation, and we had teacher training in the department. But then we'd have the add-on called special education. We might have changed the name to student support services, but it was always almost like the poor cousin of the system. It's like they were never included. The officials there were very rarely included with the team meetings, curriculum design. So we changed the way we structured our department to make sure that everyone was working together. The curriculum needs to work with student support. And we changed the title of the names from in the schools, in the district levels. So we changed the title so that all extra teachers were called education support teachers - music - math - resource. We call ours resource inclusion teachers. So all of our extra teachers support the classroom teacher. So changing the titles, clarifying the roles, changing the structure so that we're all working together to support the classroom teacher and the student, as opposed to siphoning off and being disjointed. That was it. That was important. And then sustaining, again, putting a policy 322 based on the human rights framework. Changing legislation again, changing language so that we took out any mention of special education in our Education Act. There is no definition of special needs student. It's how we design it is that there are all students guaranteed to education, but if a student needs additional support, they would warrant a personalized learning plan. And a personalized learning plan allows you to get additional support. And you're not labeled a certain category of student. You're labeled, if you are labeled, as needing additional support. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because of your diagnosis, but you may not have any diagnosis. You might have multiple diagnoses. And Kendra will talk about how we've changed our mindset in inclusive education away from just special needs students to every student, no matter what their diagnosis, label, and who they are. You can be multiple labeled. You could be a refugee from another country. You have language needs, but you also may have physical needs. You might have hard of hearing. So you have multiple aspects of your human life. So we took out the definition of special needs student. Our funding is not based on diagnosis. It's based on an education personalized learning plan. Districts are given a budget, and within their budget, they have the flexibility to allocate funds for special education. There's a human rights need, a human rights-based decision. The courts have said you can't cut essential needs for students. When you have a large budget, you are mandated to, now we provide in the formula funds for education support services, but the school regions have to provide the support. And that's an ongoing dialogue between the regions and the ministry, making sure they have an adequate budget. But it's not the parents or the family's fault. Although we get still lots of complaints or questions or requirement for parents to have that want and need extra support. So it's an ongoing discussion, as I said, that will never go away, funding and how to provide support. But we have one curriculum for all students. So one curriculum, and that curriculum and outcome would then be adapted for the student based on their learning needs. Again, I mentioned personalized learning plan, that there are personalized learning plans, and that triggers the need for, that triggers the availability for additional support. But because we want to make it as part of a plan that's developed by parents and the system and educational intervention services, but it also allows for the removal or the variation of the common learning environment. So we've defined the learning environment as a common learning environment. So we haven't said regular or mainstream, it's a common environment. And to be able to remove or vary from that common environment, then you have to have a personalized learning plan, and that has to be identified support or variation based on that student's actual need, not on convenience, not on label, but on what that student needs if it can't be provided in the regular classroom. So there's a presumption that all students belong first, and then you have to fight to get out. You have to fight to get more support or fight to get out. That's very hard for classroom teachers because sometimes they don't get the support they need and we have to make sure they get the support. But it's different than the other way around where students start out by being at a different school or being at a different classroom and they have to fight to get into the regular classroom. It's very daunting for a family to have to try to get in. So we start with hopefully every child in, and then as you need to be removed, you get removed and then you come back. And as part of a personalized learning plan. So in theory and in legislation, you're always going to find challenges where it's not working or it could be working better. And I just need to keep saying that because it's still a work in progress. Oh, sorry. I guess I went through that. It's there on the screen. And just a talking head now and change the slide. And as I said, that we eliminated mention of special education, no definition of special needs students, and the list goes on there. So I don't have to repeat that. Small story. I don't know what I have for time. How are we doing, Rita?
Well, I would say in 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes, you can still do presentation. I don't know how much slides do you still have ahead?
Oh my gosh, I got about 20.
Oh.
I'm just joking, just joking. I'm basically wanted to share the story, but but then wrap up and have questions.
Okay, so calmly.
Okay.
We have time.
Okay, this is Blake. Wanted to just share a personal story because stories are what drives our passion. The magic of learning. Stories also drive our frustration and our passion for change. And when you hear the injustice or you hear the impact of exclusion, then that drives me for change because I want to see that every child learns. And by and large, you know, the well-to-do or those that are bright, let's say, they can adapt. Yes, inclusive education is also about those students, but it's harder for the marginalized. It's even harder for the disadvantaged. It's harder for those with disabilities between our education levels, the employment levels, the financial levels. And so our system, public education, is there as an equalizer to help pull up everyone. Yes, you're going to find some examples where someone feels that they need extra support because they're advanced. It has to be just as much about those students as it is for the students with disabilities. But I mean, we focus on as well, certainly the struggling. And Blake, a few years ago was, a young student, and he has disabilities. He was in a regular school, but was not included in the classroom. He had no friends, and he would act up if he was in the classroom. He had behavior problems, and he was very isolated and could do very little in terms of his language and his skills. Like, for example, he couldn't ride a bike. He was in, this was grade 5, grade 6, probably like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in that range. And he couldn't ride a bike and he didn't have friends. And he was having problems with teachers and with the school. In fact, they were talking about expelling him from the school. And his parents didn't always necessarily have the tools, either financially, intellectually, academically. And so it was very hard for them. But with intervention from our family parent organization, they started having meetings with the school. The parents were able to gain their voice. They were able to have dialogue, constructive. Because by this time, the parents were pretty frustrated and communication had broken down. But they started bit by bit going into the regular classroom, adapting, the teacher learning that Blake needed just a little bit of change, just a little bit of differences. Maybe don't do quite the same work and with quite the same expectations, but they were able he was able to start getting included in the regular classroom. And then he started making friends. And what happened is that his classmates were all driving bikes, but Blake wasn't. But what they decided was to help Blake, and they encouraged him to bring a bike to school, and they started teaching him how to ride a bike because that was his peers, his friends. And lo and behold, eventually, Blake then became able to ride the bike, drive to school, and drive to school with friends from his class. And that was the beauty of inclusive education. He wasn't going to learn to ride the bike from a specialist, his parents not necessarily as well, but peers and friends learn from each other. They learned the value of difference, and Blake learned the value and the expectation of higher achievement and wanting to be like his friends, to ride bikes. It's a beautiful story. Blake is now a model. Actually, he models clothes, and he's still in school and progressing along. But it's really a neat little story, a small example, but there's hundreds of examples of how kids help kids. Kids see the beauty in each other, and we don't see the labels. As I said, you're going to often hear that inclusion doesn't work. Inclusion doesn't work for my child. And I say that some people that say inclusion isn't working, then it's not inclusion. Really clearly, there must be some reason why it's not working. Either the support is not there, the communication is not there, the training is not there for the classroom teacher. But if inclusion isn't working, then it's not really inclusion. Inclusion is more than just dumping into a regular school. There are many elements to that. And hopefully I could tell you a little bit from a perspective of this provincial and the state of how we made the change and continue making the change. Believe in the why. We know it's the best model to go forward. And we know that it makes a difference for children. And if it makes a difference for one, it can make a difference for all. Find common ground and build upon them. Get to yes. Instead of yes, but, get to yes, we can. Instead of yes, but this and yes, but that, yes, we can. We're doing it. And how do we go about doing it? Unwavering understanding and commitment. Inclusive education is neighborhood school, common learning environment first, and then after efforts and accommodations in the classroom, we can vary for short periods of time with a return back to the common learning environment. And build partnerships. Building those partnerships are key. Relationships are key. Relationships are key in life, between teachers, between parents and teachers, between the ministry and teachers, between the ministry and family organizations, disability organizations. Partnerships are key, and we're going to be able to do it together. Education is the great equalizer. You have a calling to change the world. Education is the best mode to influence how we become in our society. And you have this calling no matter what role you are. If I'm the chair, sitting in the chair of the minister, that's one role today and gone tomorrow. You're an educator, you're a family organization, you're a parent. We all have something to change, to make change in the world, one student at a time. Be the change you want to see, as they say. That's the famous quote. You have the power to make a difference, make that difference. Education, as I said, is key to making a difference. And I was so blessed to have that opportunity and still have the opportunity to influence and hopefully share. May you be the one who makes a difference in a child's life by believing in them when others won't. That doesn't mean that what people are doing today is not valuable. All aspects of learning is valuable. Special schools are valuable. Integrated intervention services are valuable. Everyone's doing the best they can. Can it be better? If we stopped and think, can it be better? Yes, it can. There's reasons why. How do we go about it? That's the challenge. And just keep going about it. And we will continue to make progress, and you will continue to make progress. So thank you for allowing me to share that perspective. And Ruta, I'd be happy to take questions now or take questions later, and we can go
there
from there.
Would be questions now and plenty. I don't know. You can have now a sip of coffee and be ready for a lot of questions. So thank you very much, Jody.
Okay, let me change my screen for you too.
Okay.
And you can just go right ahead there. And
yeah, so the first question from the audience, it would be, maybe you could elaborate more, how does it work, how children's needs are being assessed in school, and who does it, and how what kind of services then he or she can get, and also what kind of specialized team is working with this. So if you could describe this process in more detailed way,
okay,
we would be grateful. Yeah.
Okay, so I try to do my best. So we have a student into the classroom, we all show up, and we have different forms, and Kendra can talk about that as well in terms of what type of quote unquote assessments. There's the informal kind of assessments that a classroom teacher will observe. And there's also families will observe there being some needs. And there may be reports from the doctors, from psychologists, from, you know, also the classroom teacher may refer to our support services team. So in the region of the province, there's a support services team, and that's made up of educators, support educators, but also there would be team meetings with specialists in speech and hearing and psychological, and there may be that one of those professionals come to the school to observe the student, or the student may go to their office, but we try to bring the services to the student. They may observe the classroom, and then from there, like, they may be assigned to the additional support in another government department as well. And then it may be a challenge to get that support.
Taip gali būti iššūkių.
And so that's always a challenge for a classroom teacher that would then go to their principal or their resource teacher that's designated in the school. So a lot of the specialized teachers and support services aren't in every school all the time. They're designated and they have to share between schools. And then that student would have a personalized learning plan if they require addition, if it's deemed. Sometimes the support doesn't require an actual plan. It just means some modifications in the classroom. Those are kind of unofficial modifications, but then sometimes it does require the official plan. If they require adaptive technology or computer or whatever, they go on a list and it gets filtered into the regional team. Then if there is a personalized learning plan, then that will document the adaptation for the classroom teacher. It might adapt. They might have an adapted school schedule. Maybe they were removed for behavioral intervention. Maybe they go out of the classroom for English help, language. But we try to normalize that every student may leave the classroom at some point of the day for something. And it's not like someone's pointed out and then they have to leave and it's all this big thing, but everyone might have to leave for different reasons. Anyway, does that help some?
Yes, it does help. Okay. Yeah, it makes sense.
It's always easier said than done.
Okay, so thank you. Then we have, a lot of questions. I don't know if it even will be possible to answer, all of them at the moment, or we will leave some for the last discussion in the end. But maybe you could tell how the funding is working. What is the system for those who needs additional support? So do you get per child or Or there
right.
is other way, yes.
Yeah,
if you
well,
there is, yes, in English questions, if you are looking now.
Yep, I see now in the chat, there's some questions. So I also want to say that, yeah, that's an ongoing discussion and debate of how funding is provided from the ministry. It's not provided individually by students. So it's not diagnosis based. You don't get 2 diagnoses and get more funds. This is a problem. This is something we avoided in New Brunswick because we didn't want over-diagnosis just to get funding. And again, there's multiple diagnoses. So what we do is we provide the funds to the school district based on student population in that region. And we estimate or do a percentage of what we would think would be required for a global budget of student support services based on student population, just total population. So we're not identifying that there's 300 students with this and they need this much budget, because then you're competing to be diagnosed, and that's a medical model. Then the school district has the flexibility, but if there are individual situations where they require additional support over and above, then we have what they call integrated service teams. Anyway, it gets complicated, but we have the departments working together in the region. And if they were required for additional medical support or psychological support or justice support, then at that team, the departments work together to try to pull from their budgets to help that student.
Okay.
That maybe gives you a brief.
Yes, it gives. And for the moment, I see 2 raised hands. I would like to invite Parliament member Pinis to give his question. Jody.
Ačiū labai. Na tikrai, ačiū labai gerbiamam Carr už tikrai turiningą ir įdomų pranešimą. Iš tikrųjų, na, tikrai nuo pat pradžių jūsų sistemos įgyvendinimo iki pabaigos. Ir savaime suprantama, kad na, ir mes dabar daug kalbame apie įtraukųjį ugdymą. Iš tikrųjų, šiuo metu svarstam tam tikrą programą dėl tūkstantmečio mokyklų, iš tikrųjų, kur taip pat numatom, reiškia, kad bus skiriamas finansavimas universalioms mokykloms. Bet savaime suprantama, na, jūs ir pats minėjote, kad vis dėlto finansai taip pat yra svarbu. Nes iš tikrųjų, na, be jų nieko nepadarysi, ypatingai, reiškia, ne tik finansai, bet ir specialistų parengimas. Ir, tarkim, na, viskas yra svarbu ir susiję vis dėlto su finansais. Tai norėčiau, kaip, reiškia, politiko paklausti, galbūt buvusio politiko. Iš tikrųjų, na, kur vis dėlto prioritetas turėtų būti? Ar vis dėlto paslaugos kokybė, ar tarkim, galimybė pasiekiamumo įvairiuose taškuose. Nes savaime suprantama, tarkim, viename mieste, kuris pakankamai nedidelis, yra kelios gimnazijos, iš tikrųjų. Na ir tarkim, iš tikrųjų, ten, na, kaip pavyzdį, žmonės su judėjimo negalia, ne, su vežimėliu, reiškia, jis turėtų patekti į klases. Tai iš tikrųjų, ar yra tikslas kiekvienoje mokykloje padaryti, reiškia, universalų dizainą su liftais, su viskuo, ar tarkim, reiškia, žiūrėti, kad vis dėlto, na, galbūt būtų kokybė, aprūpinta specialistais, arba tarkim, su psichinė negalia tas pats. Iš tikrųjų, nes teko dirbti ir man Utenos, tai yra vieno savivaldybės merų, ir iš tikrųjų mes taip pat sprendėm tas problemas, tai vis dėlto, na, bandėm, reiškia, su esamais resursais išspręsti problemas, kad vis dėlto būtų kokybė, reiškia, būtų specialistai. O galbūt jų specialistų, jeigu nėra, tai, na, galbūt vienoje, reiškia, mišrioje klasėje, galbūt ten su regėjimo negalia būtų keli vaikai. Nebūtinai, reiškia, jie paskirstyti po įvairius darželius. Tai kur vis dėlto tas prioritetas? Ar iš tikrųjų kokybė paslaugos, ar galbūt prieinamumas? Ačiū Jums labai.
Well, the political answer is both. Let's try to do both. And that's the challenge, right? So I'm not picking one or the other. I'll sit on the fence, and you have to have strong armor to sit on the fence. It's really hard to sit on the fence, but both are important, of course. Now, how you implement it. So in my community, we had older schools. There might've been 8, let's say, in this area, and we had to implement gradually. So it's not going to all happen in the first, in 1 year. We only have a certain amount of funds. So what we would do is if a student was in a wheelchair and we knew that student was going into the school the next year or even in 2 years, we could plan ahead and say, okay, that student is in a wheelchair, the school is not accessible. So the district and the region would help identify what schools needed the funding first to make that school accessible. Because it's a public school, it should be accessible, universal design, but it's not a new school. So where do you put the money? Well, you're not going to automatically do every school if you don't need it, quote unquote, right away. So we would try to say, okay, a lift needs to be installed in that school. So we'll designate funds there for a couple of years. The other thing that might happen is if the student is going into that school and there's 2 levels and you need a lift, well, you would actually change the location of the classroom for that student. And yeah, it inconveniences a teacher that's used to being up here, or maybe grade 3s are always up here. Well then, but that student is coming into the school. So we're going to change the location of the classroom if it's possible. That's another way to make sure the student is accessible into the school. So there was some gradual. When we built a new school, we made sure it was based on universal design, climate change, the green school infrastructure, universal design. So it's all types of, universally designed, not just physical, but all types. So it is a challenge, but we just gradually work at it, knowing that it's the right thing to do. Did that help answer or avoid your question?
Na taip, bet pavyzdžiui, jeigu mokyklos greta, iš tikrųjų, reiškia, galima būtų, kad vis dėlto, galbūt vis tiek, pavyzdžiui, vaiką mes pavežam. Tai iš tikrųjų, ar būtinai, reiškia, kiekvienoje mokykloje turi būti, reiškia, pritaikymas, ar tarkim, reiškia, gali būti ir sudaromos sąlygos kitoje mokykloje, kurie jau turi specialistus, kurie jau turi, reiškia, pasiruošę tam.
Yeah, No, we make it so that eventually every school will be accessible. Eventually, it may take 5 to 10 years, and as students come in, but we got to remember that physical accessibility could also be for the parents of those children. So a child may not have a physical disability, but a parent might. Or what about the grandparents that are coming to the school concert? We want the school to be accessible for them. So a public service that's grounded in the human rights code or legislation should be accessible to the community. And so what we would say is, it's the theory, what's good for one is good for all, as well as this part of universal design is a family that has a stroller with babies that are coming into the school. Shouldn't they have a walkway and a ramp to come in? So when I was minister, it never though it's hard to get the priority of the funds for accessible. They just think, oh, well, we could go somewhere else. So what I had to do when I was minister is designate a certain amount of funds for improvements for accessibility, because how we worked it before was funds went to fire, safety, emergency, leaking roofs, all the needs, and accessibility never was coming to the bottom. So I said, I'm going to carve out at least a portion so that schools could get $5,000, $10,000, some money just to put in a ramp or an accessible washroom or the stage, because we would have Christmas concerts and we would say, or graduations in schools or ceremonies to leave the school to the next school. And all the kids would be up on the stage, except the child in the wheelchair would be down on the floor. And visually and emotionally, that's not inclusion. So either we bring all the students down on the floor so we're all together, or we build a ramp. So we just make it happen, but we make sure we do it in the most inclusive way. So anyways, so I designated funds as well. I remember a story of, as I said, a parent who was in a wheelchair prior to the funds to the school being accessible. Their child didn't have a disability. So when they played basketball, the parents could go watch because the gym was on the main floor, but the washroom wasn't accessible. So he couldn't really go watch a basketball game of his son. But when he went to the game, he went to use the washroom outside. And that's not a welcoming, inclusive school for that child or for that parent. So the $10,000 that went to upgrade that washroom, he was able to watch his child play basketball. And that's what it's about, right?
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you. Ačiū labai.
Thank you. Then it will be for now a last question from Kęstutis Vaišnoras. I see a raised hand.
Sveiki, tai labai dėkoju pranešėjui už pranešimą. Aš esu Lietuvos kurčiųjų draugijos prezidentas ir tikrai noriu pasakyti, kad mus kaip nevyriausybinė organizacija visada neramina tas klausimas, kaip jūs šiandien ir paminėjote, kad vis tik tai yra kelionė, o ne tikslas. Ir šitoj vietoje yra labai svarbu tos priemonės, kad jos būtų įgyvendintos anksčiau, negu vaikas patenka į mokyklą. Ir mano galbūt klausimai būtų keli. Pirmiausiai, ar Kanadoje yra patvirtintas gestų kalbos įstatymas atskiras? Antras, tai kaip jūs įtraukiojo švietimo procese užtikrinate kurčio vaiko teisę įgyti kalbą, tai reiškia mokytis savo gimtosios kalbos, gestų kalbos. Trečias klausimas, tai kaip tada vyksta komunikacija pamokoje, tarkime, kaip mokytojas šiuo atveju nemokantis gestų kalbos, kaip tas kurčiasis vaikas, būdamas klasėje bendrai su vaikais, kaip jisai gauna informaciją, kaip jisai bendrauja pertraukų metu, tarkime, švenčių metu ir visur kitur. Tai čia yra detalė. Ir ar visos šitos detalės yra numatytos atskirame kažkokiame įstatyme, todėl kad mes dabar Lietuvoje darydami teisinę analizę ir lygindami su Europos kontekstu, mes suprantame vieną, kad jeigu teisės nėra įrašytos įstatyme, tai vadinasi teisų žmonės kaip ir neturi, nesvarbu, kad yra strateginiai planai, veiksmai ir visa kita. Tai jau nuo kitų metų mes Lietuvos kurčiųjų draugija tikrai sieksime, kad Lietuvoje būtų įteisintas lietuvių gestų kalbos įstatymas ir su tuo ateinančios teisės įgyti gestų kalbą, bet labai yra svarbu tas toksai praktinis dalykas, nes išties čia yra labai svarbu, nes tai yra kita kalba, tai yra kultūra, identitetas. Tai gal galėtumėte šiek tiek trumpai pakomentuoti. Ačiū labai.
Okay. So we have Canada as a whole. Thank you for your question. We have Canada as a whole. As I mentioned, each province is separate in terms of their education policy. A larger jurisdiction like Ontario, with Toronto is, there are special schools still. There are like 9 to 12 provincial schools. They call them demonstration schools, but they're segregated residential schools. I think there's 7 actually. And there would be specialized schools. So there's a variety of implementation across the country, but with the efforts of trying to move forward. In New Brunswick, as I mentioned, the Maritimes used to have a large school for deaf and hard of hearing and visually impaired in Halifax. That was closed several years ago, and we maintained the service there where the service comes out to the schools. So there is, the first question is around the law specifically to sign language, no. And no really official recognition of deaf as a specific culture. So that's a shortcoming in Canada still. However, under the Human Rights Code, there's an obligation to provide services. And then the level of services is a variety of degrees. And it's an ongoing challenge in Canada as well for deaf and hard of hearing services and visually impaired services. And it's an ongoing challenge to educate and learn that there is a specific culture and history and difference of that between deaf and hard of hearing and other students. And it's the same way it's hard for people to understand the differences between other languages, French, English, or other First Nations. We have Indigenous cultures. We've made great progress in Indigenous, but there's still, it was still hard for me to understand. I think, oh, okay. So what we do provide the classroom teacher is a translator, sometimes 2 translators, depending on how the language will go and the needs. But what we learn is that, so we do provide the support in the classroom for translation, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, depending, because we have French language learning as a second language in English. But we also know on the surface that that's still not adequate. Translation still can't get to the heart of understanding culture and providing the full access to equal education. So I guess I'm trying to say that we do provide support. It's provided in that intervention, but there are still shortcomings that if you're doing a legal analysis, I'd be very interested in that as well. For instance, we do provide, like in our healthcare system, again, there's translations provided, sign language or Braille, or in our health system, when you have to have equal access to service, but how that's provided isn't adequate. I hope that kind of gave a bit of perspective, just to say, acknowledge that it's an issue and it's not perfect here either.
Okay.
Now, Kendra at the school level, she can provide some examples of the intervention, how it actually works, how we try to accommodate and make every child feel included, and seek support from support services at the regional district level or the provincial.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's really such an enriching presentation, which, gives a lot of food for thought, and to think how it can be applicable in Lithuania context. And now I invite everybody to have a 15-minute break. Let's come back 5 minutes after 3. And what time? It's like 9 in the morning now? No, 8 in the morning.
10 to 9.
10 to 9. Okay, so let's everybody come back 5 minutes past 3, and Jody and Kendra after 5 minutes after 9. And then we will continue with Kendra's presentations. And afterwards, there were more questions